Hello, BookTube, and welcome to the end of our mandatory read-along of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We're doing the last 15 chapters today, and then we'll be done. And our story began with trouble for the Bennet family. Mr. Bennet is a small property owner in the countryside, and he has 5 daughters. There's the eldest, the beautiful and saintly Jane. There's the second oldest, Elizabeth, who is our heroine and who is most like him in his sardonic temperament. There's Mary, who's the booktuber in the family. She's a sententious introvert who likes to read more than she likes human company. And then there are the 2 flirtatious younger girls, Lydia and Kitty. And because there are 5 girls, the estate, Longbourn, is entailed away from the Bennet family. Mr. Bennet is a somewhat lackadaisical head of the household, more fond of his privacy and his books and his sarcasm than he is of taking practical measures when it comes to his family's well-being. We see that vividly in the chapters that we're reading today. But one of the ways that is not talked about in this book, of course, is that one of the ways that he is negligent is that even at the time when Jane Austen was writing this book, a half-decent London attorney could have got around that entail. Could have simply had it amended so that the property went to the husband and the male heirs of the eldest daughter, Jane. But one way or another, as it stands now, the Bennets, Mrs. Bennet, the mother of these 5 daughters, will lose her home if Mr. Bennet dies, and all of the daughters will too, who aren't already married. We're told in these chapters, is rather heartbreaking in a way. It's tossed off quickly and it's not dwelt on, that Mr. Bennet, for years after the birth of his 5th daughter, still hoped for a son, but none ever came. And that creates a necessity for the Bennet daughters to settle themselves in the world. And that creates an urgency in Mrs. Bennet to see her daughters married, to see them well married. Now, as you've been following along here, you know that into the countryside, taking a nearby house, came a wealthy gentleman, Mr. Bingley, who is immediately smitten with Jane, and she with him. And Mr. Bingley comes in company with a friend of his, Mr. Darcy, who is far wealthier than Bingley, and who seems disdainful of country entertainments and of country people, although there's a spark of electricity between him and Elizabeth, between him and Lizzie, right away, that varies and that comes close to going out, because Mr. Wickham, one of the dashing red-coated infantrymen stationed in the neighborhood, has a horrible story to tell about Mr. Darcy. He tells the story about how he and Darcy were boys together on the same estate, and that belonged to Darcy's father, and that was managed by Wickham's father, and that Wickham was a favorite of old Mr. Darcy, who promised him a lucrative living in his lead. And then when he died, Darcy did not give him that living. And Wickham creates all of the appearance of telling this story just as a wounded martyr, and semi-involuntarily, to Elizabeth. But really, he's poisoning her thoughts of Darcy, and has intentions towards her himself. Then his intentions switch when an immensely wealthy heiress suddenly crops up, Miss King crops up, and his intentions switch to her. And we get a sense of how shallow those intentions were in Elizabeth's mind, because she understands that he has to look out for the main chance. And we learn in the segments that we've read before now that all of this happens off stage, but off stage, Miss King comes into the picture. Off stage, Wickham starts to pay his attentions to her, and off stage, she then decides abruptly to decamp, to leave the area without Wickham, and that's going to play, I think, a role in the events that happen in our chapters so far. In the last group of chapters that we read, Mr. Darcy, who has proposed marriage to Elizabeth and been decidedly rebuffed, writes her a long letter explaining the circumstances between himself and Mr. Wickham. And at first, of course, caught up in her assurance that she's right, Elizabeth Bennet refuses to believe it. But not only does Darcy in the letter recommend a third party that Elizabeth knows and trusts to verify his account, but she also starts to match his account against what she already knows herself, and starts to become aware that Darcy is telling the truth and that she has misjudged everything. Till this moment, I never knew myself, she thinks. All of a sudden, her heart has changed, and she is sorry that she rejected Darcy. And I mentioned last time that effectively, that is the point of the novel. If novel can have a point, that is the point of the novel. We don't expect, by that point in the book, we don't expect that Mr. Darcy is the type of young man to change his affections. He's not Wickham. He's not even, and Bingley doesn't either. We have a feeling that he is true, in other words. So the only real X factor was whether or not Elizabeth would change her mind. And once she does, the course of the rest of the book, in many of the Regency novels that followed in the wake of this book, the course of the rest of the book would have been gradually convincing the two families to accept the match. But in the chapters that we're reading today, Jane Austen is obviously impatient with any kind of plan like that because she throws in a plot twist. Mr. Wickham, we thought we'd seen the last of him. We thought he'd bother us for the last time. Elopes with Lydia. They head off to London en route to Gretna Green, en route to Scotland for an illicit marriage. It's a scandal that breaks among the Bennet family. And the reason that I mentioned Miss King is because Mr. Wickham's actions don't appear on the surface to make much sense. Lydia does not have any kind of money, either now or coming to her, a tiny fraction. And the estate is entailed away, and Wickham knows all this. So his motivation, we know by now that he is a thoroughly unprincipled and self-absorbed hustler. So he's not in love with Lydia. She might be in love with him, or at least with the idea of him, but the idea of being a married woman, the idea of the romance and the exoticness of it all. But he's not. And the only reason I can think of why he makes that decision, why he agrees to it, is that losing Miss King has put the fear of God in him, that he thinks this is at least something. Her father is a gentleman. I might be able to get something out of this situation, whereas I don't know what I will do otherwise. It's the closest thing I can come up with. The family is shocked, and it will be an incredible, almost indelible scandal if word becomes general. And it's in this moment that Elizabeth sees, and that Jane Austen shows us, the limitations of Mr. Bennet as a father. He is not a particularly effective figure. This is a crisis that happens to his family, and he needs other people. He needs the Gardiners. He needs, ultimately, Mr. Darcy. He has neither the wherewithal, nor the mental agility, nor the money to fix this problem, because obviously money is going to be required. Obviously Wickham wants something. He wants to be bought off. And the chapters that follow are the ones that we're reading for today, are the furious back and forth between town and country, between the waiting, the eager waiting, and the anxious worrying over how this situation is going to resolve itself. Is there any way that Lydia can be reclaimed, that she can be reclaimed for her family? And what is going on with Wickham and all that? The Gardiners are involved. Everyone's involved. Mr. Bennet goes to town. And in the course of all of this horrible stuff, this family upheaval, the young man who is going to inherit Longbourn, Mr. Collins, who originally paid his suit to Elizabeth and has now changed his mind and married the daughter of a neighboring family, he writes a letter to Mr. Bennet that is... I think I have it mentioned here. It's odious in the extreme. It's meant to show us one last time what Mr. Collins is really like. Let me see here. I wonder if it's too long for me to read. Okay, I'll read you part of it. He says, "However things may turn out, you are grievously to be pitied. In which opinion I am not only joined by Mrs. Collins, the former Charlotte Lucas, but likewise by Lady Catherine de Bourgh and her daughter. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a powerful, wealthy woman who is Mr. Darcy's aunt, and considers herself to be the governess of his fate, of his doings. and who wants him to marry her daughter, to whom I have related the affair, of course, because we know that Mr. Collins is the world's biggest gossip. They agree with me in apprehending that this false step in one daughter will be injurious to the fortunes of all the others, for who, as Lady Catherine herself condescendingly says, will connect themselves with such a family. He's writing this to the father of the daughter in the time of his crisis. And this consideration leads me, moreover, to reflect that with augmented satisfaction on a certain event of last November, for had it been otherwise, I might have been involved in all your sorrow and disgrace. Let me advise you then, my dear sir, to console yourself as much as possible, to throw off your unworthy child from your affection forever, and leave her to reap the fruits of her own heinous offense. Needs to say, letters like that don't help. They don't help at all. But things do work out. Forces gather together. It's another quirk of Jane Austen's writing. We saw it last time, in that we don't see it. We don't see it happening. We also wait back at Longbourn eagerly for word. That experience is mimicked. But it turns out that the young couple is stopped before they can get to Gretna Green and disgrace both families. And a certain amount of money exchanges hands, and they marry. They escape just barely into a just barely respectable marriage before word can get out that anything else was ever contemplated. It's not what Mrs. Bennet had in mind, but even so, it's marriage. She's at least happy that there's a marriage, that one of her daughters is off her hands. As far as she's concerned, she still has 4 to worry about. But it becomes obvious that she doesn't have to worry about Jane. Jane and Bingley are in love, and will marry. And she doesn't know anything about Darcy's letter. Nobody does, except it's in the course of these chapters that we learn that she doesn't have to worry about Elizabeth either. Because once the dust has settled, she and Darcy meet again. And it's a wonderful scene, even though it's maddening. I want to see if I have it here. Yes, they're walking together, and they're relatively alone. And Darcy says to her, "You are too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on the subject forever." He brings it up, in other words, and Elizabeth tells him that all of her thoughts have changed, that she looks now upon him favorably, upon his suit favorably. But we do not get that discussion. We do not get that. We get right up to that moment with Darcy telling her, "If you don't want to hear from me on the subject anymore, I won't say another word." And then Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. The happiness with which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But, though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her of his feelings, which, in proving of what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. That is doubly frustrating. That is doubly frustrating. Not only do we not hear what Darcy says in that moment, but Elizabeth isn't even looking at him. I think that it works in a way. If we had time, if we were doing this over 15 weekends, I think I could lay out for you the mechanics of why Jane Austen does what she does. In almost any of her dramatic scenes, in almost any of her novels, I think I can divine what she has in mind. And although I might disagree with some of her choices, I think a lot of her almost all of her choices that I can think of, there are a couple of that aren't in this book, but there are a couple that they still confuse me after all this time of reading them. But that, if we had time, I could go into detail on why I think she looks away at key moments like this. Even in the same scene, she not only looks away, but she has Elizabeth look away. Anyway, it doesn't matter, because in that moment, everything is changed completely. In that moment, any doubt that we might have had, any doubt that might have been left by Darcy's amazing letter, is gone. They will be married. And it doesn't matter what his aunt has to say on the subject, but his aunt has plenty to say on the subject. And that leads to the last great scene in this book, the scene that I think might be my favorite. My favorite moment in the book is the moment when Elizabeth reads Darcy's letter and suddenly realizes, through the power of correspondence, through the power of written word, that maybe she needs to re-examine everything that we have seen. Not in a Sherlock Holmes, the clues are all right in front of you way, but in a far more human way. That might be my favorite moment, but I think my favorite scene in this book is when, shortly afterwards, Lady Catherine de Bourgh actually shows up at Longbourn, and she is in a towering rage. She doesn't really allow herself to be courteous to Mrs. Bennet or anybody else, but she holds on to just the thinnest veneer of courtesy long enough to request Elizabeth's company wandering around out on the grounds. And the minute they are out of earshot, the minute they are in privacy, Lady Catherine turns on Elizabeth and demands to know that the story she's heard, that Elizabeth and Darcy are to be married, is false. She demands to hear from Elizabeth that not only is the story false, but that Elizabeth will never allow it to be true. She says it's impossible. She says it cannot happen. And it is a wonderful, wonderful scene. It is the two strongest-willed characters in the book, both of them with their hackles up, both going at the subject in a completely wrong way. And I wanted to read you just a bit of it because I go back to it all the time. I just love it. Let me see if I have... Let me see if I have... Oh no, I might not have the page marked. Wouldn't that be terrible? Well, anyway, I don't have the page marked, but that's okay. This has got to be the only copy of Pride and Prejudice I have where I don't have that page marked. I thought I did, but it doesn't matter because I know it inside and out. Lady Catherine lays out all... She's very angrily, but still lays out all of her reasons why this cannot happen. One of which is that from their cradles, Darcy and her daughter have been destined for marriage by their mothers. But also because the marriage isn't fitting. Because it's improper. And Elizabeth, during the brief time in the conversation when she is still fighting back instead of saying, that's enough, I don't want to hear anymore. During that brief point, she says, I see no imbalance here. Mr. Darcy is a gentleman and I am the daughter of a gentleman. And Lady Catherine zings right back with, you are a daughter of a gentleman, that is true, but who's your mother? Because Mrs. Bennet has been a horrible embarrassment in her behavior all along in the course of the book. And not only that, but Catherine de Bourgh alludes that she knows the whole story of Lydia, of the elopement. She's heard it all from Mr. Collins. And the thing that brings their conversation to an end is when she says the immortal line, are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? That's when Elizabeth says, all right, well, you've said as much as you can possibly say. I have no more to say to you on the subject. Lady Catherine basically storms off. She won't even return to the house. She just goes on her way. She's told Elizabeth, do you know who I am? I'm not accustomed to being disappointed. I will oppose you. But it doesn't matter. And I think Lady Catherine knows that. The marriage will happen. And we know that, certainly by this point. And it does. The everything that follows after that moment, there was never going to be a capitulation on Elizabeth's part. Everything that follows from that moment is just wrapping up. Wickham and Lydia have been paid off, but they're not good with money. They're basically losers, and they're going to be a trouble to Elizabeth or Jane for the rest of their lives. Wickham certainly will be, and Jane and Bingley are happily married, and Elizabeth and Darcy are happily married, and we are told that although there was an icy period for a long time at first, eventually even Lady Catherine comes around, and she comes around through the good offices of Elizabeth. She writes a letter to Darcy that Darcy simply cannot forgive, and he cuts off relations, and Elizabeth mends fences until finally Lady Catherine feels comfortable visiting Pemberley. And we never see those scenes. We never read that letter. We never read any of these scenes. There's a whole nother novel to be written of Pride and Prejudice that starts with the scene where she accepts Darcy, that starts at that moment and goes on from there. There's a whole other novel to be written, because among other things, Lady Catherine, in that great tense scene at the end, tells Elizabeth that the whole of the family is arraigned against her, not just Lady Catherine herself, but all sorts of relatives we don't know, we've never met. But that's how the novel ends. There's a minor plot kerfluffle where Wickham elopes with one of the Bennet girls and has to be bought off to prevent scandal. That presents us with some tense chapters towards the end of what would otherwise be a slide into happy marriage with Jane and Elizabeth, both of whom marry well and are going to be happy. But that is the ending of our mandatory Pride and Prejudice read along. And the only point that I want to make in conclusion, I've made this point a few times to classes and read alongs and reading groups and whatnot, is it's a familiar one. You've heard me say it before. I think that Jane Austen is unfair to the two of the three older women in this book. We have Mrs. Gardiner, who is an enigma. She's keeping secrets, I think. But she's at least capable and very nice, very likable. But the other two women, the two oldest women in the book, are Mrs. Bennet and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And we are clearly intended by Jane Austen, not by Elizabeth Bennet. We are clearly intended by Jane Austen to dislike both of them. And I don't see that. Much like Elizabeth, reading that letter and looking back at the things we've already seen and reinterpreting them, I look at the behaviors, the actual behaviors and conversations of those two women in this book, and see almost nothing that's worthy of censure. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, before that horrible scene out in the shrubbery with Elizabeth, is very generous to her and Jane. She likes them both. She's imperious and over-talkative and a little bossy, yes, but she's generous with her time, with her hospitality, with the open rooms at Rosings Park, with her carriage, with we presume money. And Mrs. Bennet is, yes, she carps about her nerves. But that's because she has a lot to worry about. Not only does she have to worry about where she is going to spend her final years on Earth, if she outlives Mr. Bennet, but also she's worried about her daughters, which is commendable. I think that we lose sight of that with so much mockery being leveled in her direction in this book. We lose sight of the fact that her caring about the well-being of her daughters is actually commendable. It's not anything to criticize her about. When she says parental malapropisms, like there's a brief period where it looks like Bingley has cut off relations with Jane, and Mrs. Bennet says, well, that her fondest hope now, her only consolation, is that Jane will die of heartbreak, and that'll show him. Show me someone whose parents haven't come up with a malapropism like that. In retrospect, almost even at the moment itself, they are funny. Mrs. Bennet is vilified in this book. Yes, she's loud and low, but she's as likable as all the other characters. And think about Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Let's say nothing for the moment of the dynastic manipulation of her and Darcy's mother chortling over infants in their cradle and making out their wedding plans. Let's say nothing of that for the minute and just think about the way she sees the situation on the ground at the end of this book. She sees the female version of Mr. Wickham. She sees a fortune hunter. Someone who has no right even to talk to her nephew, much less address him for marriage. She sees someone who is trying to worm her way into a good situation, no different than Wickham. And she's protective of her family, which, again, I want to stress, is a positive. It is a praiseworthy thing. The main problem with both Mrs. Bennet and Lady Catherine, in my opinion, the main thing they are mocked for their outward behavior. They are contemned for their outward behavior. But the main thing I think Jane Austen hates them for is that, unlike almost any other character in the book, they don't know their characters in a book. Much less that the book has a happy ending, two happy endings. They don't know that. They're acting like real people would act in the real situations in which they are in, and they're being mocked for that. It seems very unfair. Jane Austen is a great novelist, but she is often an unfair one. I could point to you a dozen examples in her other novels where, in addition to anything else that you're reading on the page, you're actually seeing something unfair on the author's part. But that doesn't change the sheer delight that it was to reread this, especially with all of you. I've loved listening to those of you who are actually reading along chapter by chapter. I have loved listening to your videos, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who are reading this who don't have booktube channels. Although why anybody in the world doesn't have a booktube channel is beyond me. But anyway, one way or another, that brings to an end our mandatory read along. I issue you now a nunc dimittis. You may depart in peace. This mandatory read-along is over. And the big question that I had last time was we have to figure out not only what we're going to read in April, but what we're going to read in the last week of March. And we still have to figure out what we're going to read in April. I have some ideas. I would like it to be something in the common domain, something that you can find a free copy of on Project Gutenberg or sites like that. I'd like it to be that. I'd rather that our read-alongs not cost money unless the quorum of you say that you don't mind if it costs money. But one way or another, if we have to decide on April, but I realized just this morning that we don't have to decide on the last week of March. You can take a week off from Steve read-alongs for the last weekend of March. You probably want one by now. So let's just do that. We'll take a weekend off. I will mull and consider for the next couple of days and then make an announcement about April. And then in April, we'll just commence with a read-along. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank you all for going through this, for doing your mandatory Jane Austen read-along. There won't be another mandatory read-along until the winter. I promise. There is one. I've heard it come up way too many times in videos where people say, I have never read X. It's almost as inexcusable as not reading Pride and Prejudice, and we're going to fix that in the winter. But for now, and for the next few months, we're at free range to do something else. So let's talk in the comments about what we want to read in April. But we are now done with Pride and Prejudice. So I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you all very much. I am still swamped with deadline work, so I don't know that we're going to talk again today. I hope that we will. But one way or another, we'll be back on Monday. Thank you, BookTube.